and change my view. All right, and yes, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Gary Beverly. Gary is the chairperson for the Yavapai group of the Sierra Club, which is the Prescott area group, and been involved with advocating for Arizona rivers for many years, particularly the Upper Verde, where he leads hikes to help people connect with the river and better understand it. He's been involved with monitoring flows and generally one of the best advocates the Verde River could have. And he is going to talk about Arizona rivers in peril. So Gary, take it away.
Okay, can I screen share?
Yep, I made you a co-host. You should be good.
Okay. All right. So let's get started here. I want to thank Rebecca Hinton for inviting me to present to you. I live in Chino Valley, which is near the headwaters of the Verde River. And when I retired from brutal long hours, retail, etc., business affairs in 2006, I started hiking on the Verde and was really amazed by it and kind of took it on as a project. And as part of that project, I started learning a lot about Arizona rivers. So I want to share with you today some stuff I've learned. And the subtitle here is what I've learned, that the Arizona rivers are degraded, exploited, abused, and they're essential for our lives, our economic life, our recreational life, and our physical existence. So I wanted to, before I get started with the river, I want to make one sad announcement. Kim Crumble is missing in Yellowstone since last Sunday. He was on a canoe trip with his half brother on Shoshone Lake. Evidently, a big winter storm came up. They found the canoe on the other side of the lake. They found his brother dead. Kim is missing. Kim was the founder of the Wildland, the Arizona Wild, and the Rewilding Institute. I was working with him on the 30 by 30 process. And he's really was, I say was, I mean, we haven't found him yet, but it's looking bad. So unless he turns up soon, we're gonna be missing a major conservation power in the state. And the rest of us are gonna have to step up and fill some big shoes. So in thinking about this whole topic, it's huge, it's humbling. You know, I've been working a little bit with Rob Peters at the Defenders of Wildlife. He's been writing a Gila River encyclopedia. We're going to talk mostly tonight about the Gila River watershed. And this is just so big and complex that it kind of had me buffaloed. And so I've fallen back on the questions that Rebecca asked me. So I want to thank her again for that, because it made this topic so that we could handle it in like 40 minutes here. So tonight I'm going to focus on perennial rivers, and I just want to define that a perennial river has a continuous flow, and there's exceptions to that. Intermittent streams is another class of stream, and these flow seasonally, maybe just in the winter, not in the summer. And ephemeral streams flow only after a strong precipitation event. So these different kinds of waterways, they're all important. It's going to be unavoidable tonight that I talk about the Verde River, but I do that in the sense that it's really an example of both the problems and the values that every other river in Arizona faces. I'm not going to talk much about the Colorado River because there's been a lot of media attention about it. That whole process is in the hands of 7 states and Mexico and federal government and major bureaucracy. And I think that the little rivers, the smaller rivers in the state, haven't gotten much attention. So I want to focus on those. So here we are. This is a chart that the Nature Conservancy did a while ago. And So here's the Colorado River. The green means that it's regulated, and indeed it's full of dams. It's been over allocated, litigated, diverted, damaged, never reaches the Gulf of California. The Gila River is the main drainage for the state. And these orange dots mean that it's formerly perennial, which is a euphemism from the always nice Nature Conservancy, euphemism for dry. Regulated rivers are green. So you can, here's the San Pedro River, Santa Cruz River, really never even flowed into the Gila River. It just kind of soaked into the ground in a big basin here in Pinal County. San Pedro still flows to the Gila. There are wet spots in the Gila. It's mostly formerly perennial. A lot of perennial streams and creeks here coming off of the White Mountains and Mount Baldy. So this was really a starting point for me in studying Arizona rivers. And so I want to just play a little video. This is a 3-minute clip out of my film, Viva La Verde, that kind of summarizes this whole thing really quickly.
Less than 10% of Arizona's riparian habitat remains alive, which explains why 17 of Arizona's 33 native fish species now have status under the U.S. Endangered Species Act, and 3 species are extinct. A living river is perennial. It always flows. A living river is dynamic. It has natural flood cycles and a floodplain. A living river supports native riparian habitat on its banks. So let's look at Arizona's perennial rivers. Are they living rivers? The lower Colorado River is heavily channelized, dammed, litigated, and allocated, fully diverted in service to the people of 7 western states. Although conservationists have successfully battled to keep the Grand Canyon free of dams, below Hoover Dam, the natural riparian habitat has been replaced by development, unnatural reservoir shorelines, or invasive cameras. The Colorado no longer flows into the Gulf of California. When the river flows across the border into Mexico, less than 10% remains, and that is used for Mexican cities and agriculture. As a result, what was once one of the largest and most productive wetlands in North America, the Colorado River Delta, is now only a memory. No water remains for wetlands. The Gila River drains southwestern New Mexico and southern Arizona. Today, the Gila is usually dry due to dams and diversions for irrigation of high water demand crops like alfalfa and cotton. Here, west of Phoenix, the last flowing water in the Gila disappears into the sand, surrounded by fields irrigated with groundwater. Now, the Gila rarely flows to the Colorado. Over 300 miles of riparian habitat has been lost. The water is gone. Historically, the Santa Cruz River flowed north from Mexico past Tucson to join the Gila River west of Phoenix. Now, only a few miles of the upper Santa Cruz has water. Near Tucson, groundwater pumping by cities and agriculture has changed the river into a dry wash deeply incised into the desert. The formerly lush, broad riparian habitat is gone due to lack of water. The San Pedro River also flows north to Mexico through Sierra Vista to join the Gila. This delicate southern desert river is vital habitat for migrating birds and local wildlife. Despite decades of work by friends of the river, in 2005, the San Pedro temporarily dried up for the first time in recorded history. And in 2012, only 29% of the river had perennial water. Another southern desert river is deeply threatened and struggles to survive because of excessive groundwater pumping. The Salt River collects water from the White Mountains and Mogollon Rim, joining the Gila west of Phoenix. At Granite Reef Dam, the entire Salt River is now completely diverted into canals. The Salt River no longer flows through Phoenix into the Gila. Another 100 miles of riparian habitat is gone. The Verde River drains the Central Highlands, joining the Salt River near Scottsdale. On the lower Verde near the Salt, 2 dams, Horseshoe and Bartlett, store water for Phoenix. A Above Horseshoe Dam, the Verde is a living river. It is perennial with natural flood flows and floodplains, and the banks are largely natural. The Verde is the longest surviving living river in Arizona, supporting over 190 miles of increasingly rare riparian habitat.
Okay, so the Verde is here on the map. And the point is that of all of Arizona's perennial rivers, dams and groundwater pumping have consumed all of them. The Colorado, the Gila, the Salt, and Santa Cruz. The San Pedro is struggling for life. The common threats to all rivers are the same: diversions, groundwater pumping, and development near the banks. So this is the Gila River watershed that we're kind of talking about here. And so that's in green. So this area up here is a little Colorado River watershed. The Little Colorado is a intermittent stream that joins the Colorado River here. Here's the canyon. These basins drain into the Colorado River. This is the Bill Williams River. And I did not include that in my list of Arizona's perennial rivers, and I should have. You know, when I did all that work, I made a couple of mistakes. The Bill Williams River is still a perennial river. It's dammed and it's actually eligible for wild and scenic river status. In the Gila River watershed, this is what we've got to deal with. The Agua Fria River is intermittent. It ends in Lake Pleasant here. So this is what the Gila River headwaters looks like in New Mexico. Here it is near Chandler on Highway 587, headed north off I-10 towards Chandler. I think that's an embarrassment. Here's the Gila River near Yuma. That's ag tailwater laced with pesticides, ag runoff, and it makes a great racetrack. Here's the Santa Cruz River near San Javier Mission, looking north up towards Tucson. Another great OHV raceway. You can see that it's channelized. There's no riparian vegetation. There's no trees. This river has been basically destroyed by urban development, municipal pumping in Tucson. Actually, this is a kind of a duplicate of the movie, but this is then and now photos from USGS took these. And so it's from the same place with the same scene. You can kind of see the outline of the hills here. And then in the next one, here's the same hill. And you can see that all of a sudden here's a dry riverbed. Before, it's full of riparian trees. And now we've got a sandy wash that's sort of desolate. In the San Pedro, the Nature Conservancy has been doing these wet-dry surveys each year. So in June 2012 was one of the worst surveys that they did. It showed it was 29% wet. And of course, I'm showing you the worst condition here. So the red spots are dry spots in the San Pedro. So Arizona's rivers are in trouble. This was the first time, this is just upstream from the Charleston Gauge. And this is the first time the river's dried up in 100 years, 2005. Robin Silver photo. Here's the Salt River in the middle of town. Nice gravel bed. The Verde, though, is surviving. This is closer to what they all ought to look like. It's perennial. It's got natural vegetation on the banks. You have cattails, gallery forest with willow and ash and cottonwoods. And at this elevation, there'll be sycamores and box elders. So this idea of a living river is important to the ecological functioning of a river. Many wildlife and fauna depend upon flood flow stages in the river. This graph came out of a report that the Nature Conservancy did on, it was a kind of a stage 1 qualitative ecological flow study on the Verde. And so spike day spawning, this is one of the endangered native fish. Spike day spawning depends upon certain flood flows in spring. Cottonwoods don't germinate and grow unless the riverbanks are moist. And so natural flood flow cycles are directly connected to the life cycle of plants and animals in the river. And that's why this idea of natural flood flow cycles is important. These days we're seeing some interest in capturing flood flows and detaining them and trying to use them for recharge to maintain a base flow on the river. But if that interferes with natural flood flow cycles, it's going to harm the wildlife along the river. This is a hydrograph that shows on the Verde. This is a very typical flow description of the Southwestern Desert River. So here on this scale, it's a logarithmic scale, 10 cubic feet per second, 100 cubic feet per second, 1,000, etc. And on this is just the years. So you can see that there's a base flow here that's around 20-ish cubic feet per second that persists. It goes up and down a little bit. Now I want to point out it's going down. And then we have these intermittent spikes of really high flows. And these are precipitation response events. You get a big thunderstorm coming through, a lot of runoff, and it's basically a flash flood. Here's a good one right here. This was 23,000 CFS, and it was in February of 1993. And this is the record high flow on the Verde. So 23,000 CFS. Do you guys know how much the Colorado flows normally, just on your average day? It kind of depends on how much AC is required in Phoenix, but someplace between 8,000 to 12,000 CFS through Marble Canyon and the Grand Canyon. There was 2 Colorado rivers going down the Verde in response to a flood. So this is the normal flood flow cycle on Southwestern Desert Rivers. You'd find this on the San Pedro, on the Santa Cruz, on all these rivers. Just to look at drilling down at this in a little finer detail, you can see that in about 2 hours, it went from about 30 CFS to 9,000. And this was on January 22, 2010. That's because there was a rain on snow event in the uplands. And so it really did a gusher. These flood flow cycles are really important. They clear out the riparian zone along the river. They clean out a bunch of trash. And actually they flush a bunch of non-native fish all the way down to Horseshoe Lake. So the native fish then recover and can live nicely. So let's see what the source of water for rivers is. Well, it all starts with rain. And when rain falls on the land, some of it recharges the aquifers that feed the river. So if rain falls on, say, this grassland, this yellow color here would represent alluvial fill up against a hard rock mountain front in the lighter colors. So rain on this alluvial fill, typically 1 or 2% of it will infiltrate. Very, very low. Most all rain on land surfaces evaporates. Some of it will accumulate in a channel. So this would be an ephemeral stream. And many times these ephemeral streams are very directly connected to the aquifer. Water will infiltrate very quickly through these ephemeral streams. And these are major recharge sources for our rivers. So, you know, the Trump administration Clean Water Act really tried to deregulate ephemeral streams in Arizona. There's like 40,000 of them or something. But these are really essential components of the hydrologic system, and they deserve protection from pollution and from construction and obstruction. I hope that that's maybe going to get fixed in this as the Biden administration redoes the rules on that. So this would be a ephemeral channel recharge. recharge, then the rainfall hits the mountain, sun runs over the rocky surface of the mountain and infiltrates at the border between the aquifer and the hard rock mountain block. So that's mountain front recharge. And then mountain block recharge is when it just soaks into cracks in the mountain and the rocky structure of the mountain. Remember Craig Child's book, House of Rain, where the indigenous understanding of this hydrologic cycle involved the mountains being full of water, and they were right. So all this stuff is recharged into the aquifer, and the aquifer then feeds the river. Now, so there's a groundwater component to rivers, and then there's a surface water component from these channel recharges. So groundwater feeds rivers. Here's a USGS diagram showing that groundwater flowing into a river. So here you see that the water table in the surrounding landscape is higher than the stream bed. So groundwater moves downhill in response to gravity. It moves slowly. I think a lot of people don't really think about that, but groundwater moves. There's an underground river underneath our feet. Sometimes in clay substrates, it might only move, a millimeter a day. In other kinds of substrates, it could go 10 feet in a day. So groundwater moves, but it moves slowly and it moves towards the stream. The stream bed is the bottom part of a watershed, and everything flows towards the stream. So when you put a well in, the next to the stream or miles away from the stream, even, it will affect the river. The well then takes water out of the ground. So that means that you're removing water from storage, and where the water table was up here before, now it dips down to the well. It makes what's called a cone of depression. Groundwater is flowing into the well and being removed by the well. And notice that now the groundwater flow direction is from the stream to the well. And so putting the well here is affecting the stream. It's taking water from the stream. This is a super important point. The aquifer river connection is key. And here's another representation of it. If the river is flowing this way, the water table is higher than the river bed, and so groundwater flows into the river. So this kind of a stream is actually gaining flow as it moves downstream, and it's called a gaining stream. Another case would be if the water table is below the riverbed. Now, water from the river is actually flowing downhill, downslope into the aquifer. And so the river is losing water to the aquifer. And as the river flows down through this circumstance, it's losing flow, and it's called a losing stream. And the next worst condition is that when the water table drops really far down, the stream is disconnected from the water table. And in this case, it's really losing and it's going to dry up. So this is a very active interaction that changes, and it's different in different spots along the river. The river and the land are kind of alive together, and they interact and they change their relationship as it goes downstream. And so perennial rivers, especially Southwestern desert rivers, can actually disappear underground when they come into, say, a basin that's really gravelly and where water just soaks in. And then they'll pop up maybe in a rocky canyon a mile downstream. And it's all called a perennial river. So it's kind of tricky. Nothing in nature is simple. Huh? So here's an example of a losing river. That's that photo that Robin Silver took of the Gila River disappearing into its riverbanks as it's headed west, surrounding by fields that are pumping groundwater out of the river. Now the pumps aren't in the wet part of the river. They're in the banks on the side. They're in that aquifer that's directly connected to the river. So I want to talk about the threats to flow on rivers. So one threat is climate change. Obviously, as since about, especially, well, temperature changes have been rising. And so here in the Southwest, This is for Yavapai County. Since about 1970, temperatures have really been shooting up. Projections indicate that we're probably going to wind up with 10 degrees higher temperatures by the 2085s than we had in the 2000s. So this is all based on the climate change modeling. This is RCP 8.5, the do nothing scenario, which is where we are now and where we desperately need to get out of. But basically heat means increased evapotranspiration. Plants use more water evaporates from land surface, soil moistures decrease. And so when it does rain, there's less aquifer recharge. So that climate change is a big future problem for us, an existing problem for us. Drought is another big issue. So here again, for Yavapai County, this red line is a 5-year, 10-year running average of precipitation, which is the dot. So the precept's really variable. The running average kind of straightens it out. So since about 1980, we've been in a reduced rainfall regime, and projections here indicate that actually precipitation is going to maybe increase a little bit in our area, which is odd. But what you have to remember is because there's higher temperatures, the water deficit for the environment grows by 20%, 25%. And that spells disaster for rivers. It's reduced runoff and reduced recharge. So high temperatures are really important in our climate change future. Just to back that, to burn that in, this line here represents our current cumulative water deficit in the Southwestern basin. And you can see that it's lower than a lot of these historical lines. It's lower than this line. Which one is this one? Oh, it's a drought that occurred in the this is the 16th century mega drought. We're in a worse drought cycle right now than we've been in since the 16th century. And it shows no sign of relenting. So the climate change issue really affects our rivers. This makes them all the more sensitive to our management and mismanagement. We need to realize that these rivers are in a very delicate condition and they need special care. And we'll need for many years until and if we can get this climate change issue under control. Another monster threat to rivers is Arizona water law. You know, surface and groundwater are hydrologically connected, as I described earlier, but they're legally separate. And this is just a major flaw in water law that probably cannot be fixed in Arizona without tearing the state to pieces. That's probably not going to happen. We have to find a way to work around this. It's a legal and management nightmare for rivers in managing river flows. It increases the stress on rivers and springs. And then we have a separate body of groundwater law that's absolutely no help at all. You know, in Arizona, we've got the active management areas that include 87% of the population of the state and 13% of the land area. The other 87% of the land area is the watershed where all our valuable rivers are. In that area, there are no limits on groundwater pumping. As a matter of fact, they don't even measure how much groundwater they pump. As a matter of fact, in the last legislature, they didn't even give a hearing to a bill that would require them to monitor wells that were over 10 acre-feet a year. And that's not a domestic well. That would be a big stock well or an irrigation well. So groundwater law is of no help here, and it's actually constitutes a threat to Arizona rivers. Groundwater pumping captures stream flow. This is probably the biggest threat area that we have. You know, if you don't have water, you don't have a river. This photo is of railroad draw, a tributary to the Verde that is an ephemeral stream. So groundwater pumping by agriculture is a huge threat. They just keep at it. It just keeps going. And water keeps coming out of the ground. These pumps spread out in pivot systems. And municipal pumping in our area, the city of Prescott and Prescott Valley pump 77% of the groundwater out of our active management area. And that's water that serves homes and families and businesses. It's not done particularly efficiently. That's a problem. It's done legally under Arizona water law, and they don't have to compensate for any of the water that they pump. It's a couple days ago, I did a presentation for the Citizens Water Advocacy Group, and I added up all the legally allowable water pumping in our area. And water law creates all this paper water, permission to pump water that really doesn't exist. And so if this area is about 140,000 population, there's enough paper water authorized, legally authorized, to grow the population to about 400,000. And that's in state law. And that's under our fantastic Arizona groundwater management law. That pumping is lowering the water table in our area. It's causing wells to dry up on the edges of the aquifer. It's caused Del Rio Springs, which was the traditional headwaters of the Verde River, to basically dry up. And this is really hard to get a handle on because these people now have legal rights. And when you have legal rights, it's really hard to take them back. So this is a huge threat. And this is a huge threat on the San Pedro also. And I've sort of followed those controversies on the side road, on the San Pedro, but the Verde's been my main source of attention. So I can't speak in great detail about the San Pedro, but it's a similar issue. You know, groundwater pumping will de-water the river. It's all pretty well clear based on groundwater modeling and science. But Arizona water law permits that to happen. Another threat is dams and diversions. So in the Colorado River, this is a little map of Colorado River watershed showing it's part of 7 states in Mexico, and all the little black dots are dams. There's a lot of dams on the Colorado. The Bill Williams River is here, and there's Alamo Dam at the head of that. This is the junction of the Santa Maria and the Big Sandy, and this is the Bill Williams. The Gila River coming out of New Mexico through southern Arizona. There's Coolidge Dam here. Here's where the San Pedro comes in. And then there's a diversion dam here, and I forgot to type the name in, sorry, and I can't remember it now. The diversion dam diverts water for the Gila River Indian communities' agricultural operations. They have some of the largest water rights to the Central Arizona Project Canal. On the Salt River, here's a mass of black dots. There's 5 dams on the Salt River. It's 100% diverted. The Verde River has 2 dams, Horseshoe and Bartlett, but there's continuous flow through those dams, because right here at the junction of the Verde and the Salt is the Fort McDowell Yavapai Reservation. They have Federal Reserve water rights that require the Salt River project that manages the dams. It requires SRP to make a continuous flow release through the reservation. So thank you to the Fort McDowell Yavapai people. Another threat is water pollution. So agriculture, I showed some ag runoff in the Gila. It's fertilizers and pesticides, salts. Urban areas are really problematic for rivers, contributing polyaromatic hydrocarbons. Those are off of asphalt pavement, highly carcinogenic substances, Aliphatic hydrocarbons, these would be residues from fuel and oil. Chlorinated hydrocarbons like dry cleaning fluid. Huge problems with that in Cottonwood and Prescott. Basically dry cleaners that just dumped all their fluid into the ground. Pollutes groundwater, which flows into the river. And we're working on a case like that in Cottonwood right now. Fire retardants, that'd be out in the Luke Air Force Base. Trash, sewage from septic tanks. I mean, the rivers are in the bottom of the watershed, and everything nasty that humanity does goes in that direction. Everything nasty that mines do flows down there too. Mining drainage, acid mine drainage, the mining in this area, copper, anything up with sulfate-based ores is going to create acid mine drainage, particulates, heavy metals. And then sand and gravel quarries release a lot of sediment. So water pollution from human activity is a big issue. Grazing, trespass grazing and riparian issues is very destructive of riparian areas. So I don't know if Sandy remembers this, but we were on a Verde hike and we're walking down this really pristine part of the river and we see this herd of cattle sitting there looking at us. And that was embarrassing and shocking. And we got the rancher to get those out of there. They actually leaked out to the river from a gate that some careless hikers left open. So I don't know if I blame this on the cows. I don't blame it on the rancher either. Careless campers are a big, big problem. Now, in some areas, ranchers are a big problem, and the Forest Service is a big problem with this. Center for Biological Diversity just popped a corker of a lawsuit against Apache sitgraves, Coronado, Prescott, Coconino, and they're now settling those. You may have seen some press releases lately that they've achieved a settlement with the Apache sitgraves forest to get cattle out of the rivers in the jumping mouse habitat, an endangered mouse species that's in the high mountain meadows. So thanks to CBD, there's a lot of control happening now. Prescott Forest got wind of this suit, and all of a sudden, they want to work with us. They want Sierra Club to help them monitor the rivers, to help them get these things out of there quickly. And we're happy to do that. And so we're forging a much better working relationship with the forest now that they've shown some good faith interest in keeping these critters out of riparian areas. Disrespectful campers, hey, well, what can I say? You know, destructive recreation, illegal off-road vehicles were a huge problem on the Upper Verde, and they still are in the Lower Verde, and they still are permitted down there, amazingly enough. This causes property damage, noise, dust, litter, erosion, bad trails, habitat damage, wildlife disturbance. They leave gates open, they cut fences, they allow cattle to get into the river. So OHVs have no business being anywhere near a riparian area. And then we have wildlife water tanks, and cattle water tanks just shot up so they don't hold water. I mean, we're our own worst enemy. The threat here is us. There's too many of us. We're unwilling to constrain growth, seem to have the idea that it's physically possible to have continuous growth. We're even reluctant to constrain consumptive water use. I mean, something as basic and rudimentary as water conservation is a difficult sell. I mean, at the state ADWR, every now and then they talk about water conservation a little bit, but all their efforts to fix the water resource problems here are supply side fixes, you know, like import water from the Missouri River, build a half dozen desalination plants on the Gulf of Cortez and a 1,000-mile pipeline to send them up to where they need to be. I mean, I think we could do a lot better at learning to live with what we've got. Basically, our society has historically viewed rivers as objects to exploit. And we've done that. And you can see the results on the Gila and the Santa Cruz. So why should you protect rivers? Well, it's a water supply supplies for city and agriculture. We need both of those. For wildlife, it's super important. Recreational, cultural, and historic preservation. And just because it's pretty, it's nice, it's good for your soul. So I want to talk about the wildlife part of this, and this is going to be referenced to the Verde because that's the information I have. I don't think this is going to be very much different in any river you look at. The Verde Watershed is 5.8% of Arizona's land area. It has 78% of the breeding bird species in Arizona, with 6% of the land area. So there's your biodiversity hotspot indicator right there. 15 times more diverse than your standard land area. It has 25 of 28 bat species existent in Arizona, 17 and 19 carnivores, 5 of 6 native ungulates, we're only missing the bighorn sheep, and a bunch of lizards and snakes. In terms of native fish, this is a Nature Conservancy diagram they did to represent fish richness. And so the thicker blue line is the greater number of native fish present in the stream. So you've got the Verde here, you've got Eagle Creek, Yavapai Creek, and you get the idea there's only a few spots here that really are rich anymore in native fish. So I think earlier I said 33 native fish species. These numbers seem to float around. The Gila Encyclopedia has 36 native fish species. So someplace in there. I said 3 was extinct earlier, and he said 1 is extinct. And so now I don't know. 20 of these fish are listed under the Endangered Species Act. So why are all these fish in such trouble? Because we've killed their habitat. We've dried up their rivers. Important bird areas. You know, there's 48 IBAs in Arizona, and these actually form flyways along the rivers. So here's the San Pedro River. So down here is the Central Sierra Madre Highlands in Mexico. And so migratory birds come up this way, up the San Pedro. And of course, you've all heard that the San Pedro is really rich in migratory bird species. You can see trogons, all kinds of hummingbirds, etc. Yellow-billed cuckoos come right up through here, right up into the Verde. The Verde's critical habitat for these yellow-billed cuckoos. That's this guy here. Then they have a shot into the Colorado River drainage and up into the Pacific Northwest and the Central Midwest. So this whole, and the red spots here, IBAs. So you can see how it kind of traces this south to north migration pattern through central Arizona along our rivers. This is a blackhawk, a common blackhawk, which is not ESA listed, but they're really cool birds. This is an osprey. And here's one of my favorites, a turkey vulture. These are the most amazing flyers you'll ever see. So what can we do? How can us Sierra Club people protect rivers? Well, for one thing, you can help the water sentinels. Here's our water sentinels coordinator, Jennifer Martin, at work. And she looks great. She's got a clipboard full of notes. Citizen science volunteers check water quality and do flow monitoring on the Verde and San Pedro rivers. They do stream cleanup and repair and restoration, Tres Rios and other areas. And here's Jennifer's contact information. I'll just pause here a little bit and let you note down the information. And good way to get started in protecting rivers is to join a work party and join the Water Sentinels. Water Sentinels has been monitoring water quality on the Verde since 2007. And we have a tremendous baseline data. We monitored, I think, every other month for, I don't know, over 10 years. So we have about 72 baseline data points. And for water quality, we were checking nitrogen, phosphorus, dissolved oxygen, temperature, pH, conductivity, E. coli, turbidity. I think that's it. and arsenic. And on the Verde, we found that the water quality is great. It meets the Clean Water Act standards for body contact in every respect. We had 1 E. coli exceedance in all those years, which is basically not enough to worry about. And we had arsenic got up to 28 parts per billion one test, and the EPA limit is 30. The arsenic in the river is natural sources from volcanic rocks that are in contact with the groundwater that supplies the base flow of the river. So anyway, big plug for Water Sentinels, really important and useful group. This is one of the great things that Sierra Club does. So now that the Verde is excellent water quality, we can apply for Outstanding Arizona Water Quality, Outstanding Arizona Water Status. So this is Arizona Department of Environmental Quality does this designation because this is an aspect of the Federal Clean Water Act, and it's a rule that ADEQ administers. Basically, once you get this designation, it requires non-degradation of water quality. So you have to qualify for water quality before you get this designation. So Sierra Club applied once, I don't know, maybe in 2012 or something like that. And ADEQ just kind of stiffed us. They just ignored us. It was sort of maddening. So we recently, there was another triennial review of surface water quality standards that was required. And so we applied again. And this time we got a whole different response from ADEQ, thanks to this lady right here. This is Megan Smart. She's head of ADEQ's water quality citizen science program. And this is Jessica, I forgot her last name. So Megan's getting water quality out of the Verde, and Jessica's wiring up the truck battery with an inverter to run the E. coli sealing machine. And so they've got gear on the truck. These gals drive 4-wheel drive truck in a lousy road with all this equipment, set it up and do all these tests on the spot. I think they're all fantastic. This is Sycamore Creek in the Sycamore Wilderness area just north of Clarkdale, just before it enters the Verde. And so our application for Outstanding Arizona Water includes all those reaches that are part of our Wild and Scenic application. So it's the lower part of Sycamore Creek, Verde River, and the lower part of Granite Creek. But I get ahead of myself because the next thing I want to talk about is Wild and Scenic Rivers. Now, here's the big way you can help. And we're at the point now where we need some help. So this is the logo photograph for the Upper Verde Wild and Scenic River. In 2011, we the Sierra Club completed I think a pretty high quality application proposal for Upper Verde Wild and Scenic River. And so that's pending. Right now in Arizona, the wild and scenic rivers we have is, okay, here's Fossil Creek. And so the red means wild class, and this means recreational class. Wild and scenic rivers have these classifications within certain reaches of river. The classification of wild and scenic and recreational the words don't mean in the law what they mean to us here. You can have a lot of fun on a scenic river. It doesn't have to be recreational. And a recreational river can be really scenic. So rather those designations have to do with the amount of bankside development on the river. So wild river will have none. Scenic river has little, maybe one road crossing might be allowed. Recreational rivers might have parallel roads or actually structures on the banks. So the Fossil Creek Wild and Scenic River was designated in March of 2009 as Arizona's second wild and scenic river, and it's 16.5 miles. The first wild and scenic river in Arizona was the Verde Wild and Scenic River, which does from here, there's a wild section, This starts at Red Creek on the Verde. Just for reference, in here someplace is Sheep Bridge, if you know where that is. So it goes almost all the way down to Sheep Bridge. So Red Creek up to, I don't know how to tell you where that boundary is, but it goes all the way up to Beasley Flat. So here's I-17 where it crosses the river at Camp Verde, and about 10 miles down is the last, decent public access area. And there's a big park here, and it's wild and scenic for 40.5 miles all the way down to almost to Sheep Bridge. So that was designated in 1984, and it's 40.5 miles. And we're looking for a third wild and scenic river, and that's up here in the Upper Verde. So headwaters are especially important to protect because any problems here are going to show up all the way downstream. One thing I want to point out is the idea of overlapping protections. So here we have a wild and scenic river, and that's running through the Mazatzal Wilderness area. So the wilderness area and wild and scenic rivers have different protections. And one's not necessarily better than the other, they're just different. For instance, in a wild and scenic river, you can have motorboats, although most don't. In a wilderness area, there's no motors allowed. So by layering protections, by giving an area, both wilderness area and wild and scenic river protection, you actually increase the level of protection on that landscape. The other thing I want to point out here is there's all these inventoried roadless areas, wilderness expansion areas, all the way up the river. And so this looks like this could really become an excellent protected corridor. And I want to come back to that in a second. So the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act recognizes a river segment as a national treasure. It protects it from federal water projects, diversion, mining, and roads. It maintains free-flowing water quantity and quality. These are all good things. And it requires a comprehensive resource management plan. That has to be done with public participation. We just completed that process for the Fossil Creek Wild and Scenic River. That CRMP is supposed to be done within 3 years. Well, it took them from 2009 to 2021. What's that? 12 years to do it. And the plan we got is flawed. I worked on that plan for 9 years with Coconino National Forest. We made some big advances and we made the plan better, but it sure has some flaws to it. And but it would have been a lot worse if we hadn't participated. So I think we made a positive difference on it, even though the result isn't totally satisfying. And I think what I can do, maybe for the next, Don, sort of for the next chapter conservation committee, give me some time. And I want to describe what happened to the fire that went through Fossil Creek and some more stuff about the management plan. Could you put me on the agenda, please?
Will do. Sure.
Okay, so wild and scenic rivers do not guarantee stream flow. And that's disappointing. And the reason is because the threats to stream flow are usually outside the boundaries. The Wild and Scenic River boundary, the corridor, is like a half-mile wide, centered on the stream. And the groundwater pumping outside of that area is not going to be constrained by the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. But it does create an in-stream flow right that vests on the date that it was designated by Congress. And that right is subject to Arizona's priority system. So it wouldn't affect anybody that had a earlier right to use the river water, upstream or downstream, but it might constrain new water users from using more water. So a really brief summary on the water rights. This gets really complicated. You can ask questions if you're brave enough. But the Wild and Scenic River doesn't create any additional demand. This in-stream flow right that is created with the river is water that has to remain in the river for the purpose of supporting the outstanding and remarkable values on the river. These are some of the real benefits of wild and scenic rivers. these outstanding remarkable values have to be, they can't be degraded and they should be improved in the management plan. So there's 7 of these outstanding remarkable values that are mentioned in the federal act. Verde has them all. You only need 1 to qualify as a wild and scenic river. So this is one of the big benefits of wild and scenic river. It really protects the habitat and the wildlife. So this is the wild and scenic river proposal for the Upper Verde. So there's 6 segments, it's 52 miles of river. And here the cool thing is right here. When we did this proposal, we worked with Prescott National Forest and they evaluated the river and decided it was eligible. And then by Forest Service policy, they now have to manage it as though it is a default wild and scenic river until Congress declines to authorize it. So we can't get this into Congress now because the local congressman is an enemy, does not like public lands. And until he dies or leaves, we're just going to wait. It's the conservationist strategy. Wait them out. Except we have a really cool opportunity coming up, and I want to conclude with this. You know what 30 by 30 is? It's an effort to preserve 30% of the state's land area by 2030. It's part of President Biden signed off on this. There's a state steering committee with Sierra Club representatives, the Wilderness Society, Center for Biological Diversity, Defenders of Wildlife, like that, people working on statewide proposals for this. Some of the early efforts, the first things that they're going to do is work on Grand Canyon protection. But we're working right now on a statewide wild and scenic river bill. So at the meeting up there, I presented this Verde Watershed proposal. And so right now there's like 402,000 acres of land contiguous to the river that has some protected status. And what we want to do is to create connectivity between these protected areas and to increase the protection levels. So to do that, we designate this wild and scenic river up here. We make all these IRAs and potential wilderness areas. That would take us up to over 700,000 acres of protected land in the Verde Watershed. So that's the goal eventually. So the statewide wild and scenic river proposal is in the ideation stages at this point. I did just a little chart listing some of the potential wild and scenic rivers that the BLM identified in 1993. And so first of all, why haven't we previously acted on this? I don't know. I guess we get so busy keeping bad things from happening, we don't have any mojo left to make good things happen. So it's time to do it now. This is the hot spot, the hot time to do this. There's a lot of little small segments. Look at this, 6.4 miles. These are important. You don't have to have a 40-mile segment. A little short segment in that environment is essential for wildlife, and they're really important. The problem is that all of this data that BLM did is from 1993, so it's old, it needs field checking, and here's where you can help. We need volunteers to do field checking and to help us renew the basic good work that BLM, National Forest, and National Park Service did on this. So if you're willing to participate in this, email me here, yavapaisierra@gmail.com. So this was a map that the Arizona Wilderness Coalition did, and actually Center for Biological did this and Diversity did this in 2019 based on all these 1993 studies. And you can see that there's rivers all over the state. So there's a river near you that needs your love and help. So step up and email me at yavapaisierra@gmail.com. Let's see what we can do. The 30 by 30 steering committee is now developing a process to do this. We're seeking staffing and funding for that staffing to do this. And we'll be hearing more about that in the chapter conservation meeting. So you got a choice. You can pick your future. What do you like? You want a future with gravel, cobble, and hot, dead stick plants and our rivers? Or do you want a future with a rich riparian forest and flowing rivers and burbling water and wildlife? It's